Today, I am pleased to welcome Len Breskowitz. Len is a certified exit planning advisor and focal point business coach in Boston. He grew up above his family's small business, which set his professional trajectory and love for small to mid-sized businesses. Len has played key roles leading FP&A and launching QuickBase at Intuit to scaling Constant Contact's partner network from 50,000 to over 500,000 users. He's played critical roles at Grasshopper, Repsly, and Nextiva. Today, Len helps small owners, business owners, especially those nearing transition, maximize value and prepare for life after business. And so with that, Len and I today are going to talk about company-specific risk premiums and all the implications that goes into that. But before we jump into that, I'd like to let Len introduce himself and a little bit more about his background.
Oh, thank you, William. It's great to be here. Appreciate the invite. You hit on some of the high points. I literally grew up above a small business that was 24/7. I learned the ins and outs of what it took to run a small business. And then my entire corporate professional career was focused on serving small businesses as customers. That's what I live and breathe. I decided to leave corporate a couple of years ago and got into coaching, small business coaching, as you might imagine, and then really started to focus on that kind of getting business owners and their companies ready to transition out of. It's been kind of a lifelong of experiences getting here, but there's a huge need for what I do and get a ton of satisfaction out of helping business owners get ready.
No, that's great. And I know you and I have talked before, and deal killers are always one of those things that you try to teach business owners how to avoid. Lately, there's been a growing sense of transactions happening, but the sense that the leader is the business and people trying to challenge the valuation of it. So do you want to talk about a little bit about how do you think about the leaders of business? How do you avoid that? And ultimately, like, what are the deal killers that are associated with people's perspective of the leader that's trying to exit or trying to sell the company?
There's a bit of a double-edged sword here because in order to have a great small business, you need a great leader. You need a great owner who sets the vision and implements things and makes sure that the business is growing and taking care of clients and all those kinds of good things. The other side of the sword is that the business, in order to be saleable and to be valuable, has to be able to operate without that owner. Because ultimately, if you're thinking about a small business that somebody is interested in acquiring, they don't want to acquire the owner, right? The owner is riding off into the sunset. So that business needs to operate effectively without that owner there. That's a big piece, a big deal killer. You can see it happen is when a potential buyer comes in and says, "So, Mr. or Miss Owner, what do you do in the business?" And if the answer is, "I do everything," the potential buyer heads for the exit. So it's really got to be important that the business can operate without the owner there in order for it to be saleable.
How do you start that process? Because I know, owners hold real tight. I'm an entrepreneur, so I know I hold on too tight. How do you get them to recognize they need to let go? Because I just came from this really interesting Exit Planning Institute conference or little chapter session, and all they did was talk about the whole issue with leadership risk and transition and it being the business. But how do you get them to recognize it? Because that seemed to be the conflict.
One of the ways I do that is a pretty extreme example, and it's meant for a little bit of shock value, to be honest with you, is I basically say, if you need to make every decision, if the business falls apart without you there, your business is worth $0, right? Literally nobody wants to buy you, Mr. or Miss Business Owner. So that's a bit of a shock to the system that works. I then turn to maybe some softer gloves, some softer kid gloves, and say, look, don't you want to be able to de-stress? Don't you want to be able to take more time away from the office and make more money and grow your people? Those are the positive benefits that come from letting go. There's a little bit of carrot, there's a little bit of stick, and hopefully between those two, the business owner starts to realize that in order for this thing to be worth something, they've got to let go.
That's interesting, the carrot and the stick. Do you have any specific questions? Because I know, like, for example, at this little conference talking about exit valuation and the whole concept of company specific risk premium, they were always looking at the leader has all the relationships with the suppliers, the leader has all the relationship with the vendors. And then on the flip side, they're saying, but the leader doesn't, or the owner doesn't know that or doesn't recognize that. Is there any way you can help, or how do you think about helping the leader get that or become aware of that issue? Because it seems like they got blind spots.
I have this kind of litmus test that I've shared with you. I call it a simple question. Can you take a 2 week vacation from your business without your phone, without your laptop? What will your business be like when you get back? On its surface, a pretty simple question, but it really delves into the kinds of things you're talking about. It's a simple way to describe owner risk premium. It's impossible to put an analytical answer to a business owner. What I do is I gauge their reaction. And if they have a look of horror on their face to say, oh my God, I can't leave for a day, then I know that the risk premium for based on the owner is very high. If they look at me and say, yeah, did it last quarter, not a problem, everything's fine, I know then that they've got that separation. It's kind of based on the reaction. Then there's some in between, like, well, probably a couple days, but maybe not 2 weeks. You know what I mean? So there's gradations within. But the answer to that question gives me a pretty good idea of whether this thing can operate independently or not.
And so if they do say, oh my God, I can't do it. I can't step away, as a, come, from the exit planning and the coaching perspective, how do you begin the process for them to get them to do that and to get them to position the company to be a company and not a reflection of their person?
What I do is assure them that I'm not going to ask them to completely let go of everything on day one. So I think there's a panic around that when you say you need to become independent, and they say, well, okay. And I'll tell you why. A lot of business owners' identity is wrapped up in their company. So the idea that they're no longer needed or no longer important goes way beyond the analytical and really hits at the emotional level. One piece is I say, this isn't going to happen overnight. But the way that I get them moving is I try and get them to invoke the 80% rule. And the 80% rule is delegate some task. And that could be to your staff, that could be to a virtual assistant, whoever it is. Delegate a task to somebody and let them do it. And the 80% part comes in. If they can do the job 80% as good as you can, let it go. There's a whole thing of nobody can do it as well as I can. That may be or may not be true, to be honest with you. But the whole idea is that if you can get something low value off your plate and let somebody else do it, it's a huge win on a few fronts. One, you're enabling your staff, if it's your staff, to get better and take on responsibility, but you're also de-stressing yourself. That's how I come at this is there's an emotional piece to it, but there's also just, we're going to do this step by step. And once you've done one, then you build a little confidence and you can take on the next one.
You brought up a really interesting thing that I've heard from other people that I've talked to, particularly in the wealth management space, is the importance of identity, and that if the identity is too strongly associated, the owner, the founder, the leader with the company, they can't let go. And oftentimes they don't know what they're going to do afterwards, or like getting family pressure to sell, or they've got, how do you help them find that off ramp identity wise?
It's super important. And there's a part of you might ask me at some point, hey, what should somebody do now? Right? What should if they're faced with this? And one of the components, there are four components I talked about. I'm going to fixate on one to answer your question, is the personal side, right? A big thing that a business owner needs to do is define what their next big adventure is. I'll give you the negative example. If a potential buyer comes in, sits down with a business owner and says, what are you going to do when you sell? And that business owner says something like, oh, I'm going to play golf or I'm going to travel. Bad answer. That's not a plan, right? You need a plan that is going to occupy your time and give you that identity. That could be, hey, I'm going to start a nonprofit or volunteer. I'm going to teach something, or I'm going to have some activity. Having the next adventure is a big piece of it. The second big piece is to discuss that with your family, right? So that your family is on board with what your plan is. What that does, it solves a bunch of problems. One is they know they have some input. The other piece is it really decreases the likelihood of miscommunication if there's a potential succession plan in place. A lot of business owners, about half of them think that their family member, they're typically their kids, are going to take over the business. That only happens about 25% of the time. So there's a big gap there. What is that gap? It's a communication gap, right? It's because the elder and the younger generations were afraid to talk about it. Then you get into these awful situations where nobody's clear on what's happening. That's one component that I really tend to focus on is know what you're going to do next.
That's fascinating, especially around because I didn't know the statistic of 50% want to pass it on to legacy and only 25% wanted. Running down that vein, how important is it to bring the family into the pre-due diligence, the consideration? Like, how early do you bring them in? How do you bring them in without being a family counselor? How do you bring them into the process where you start to get that clarity? Because I think de-risking the business, if the leader's holding on too tight or the owner's holding on too tight because they think they're going to transition to the next generation, it might change the perspective of, okay, I need to let go now because I won't be able to step back in, or I'm not going to step back in because obviously I've just sold the company.
It's really dependent on the family situation. Normally, my recommendations are as early as possible, just to float things. And when I talk about exit plan, it's not a 6 month process, right? I'm typically talking about 3 to 5 years in advance. Sitting down with family members and saying, "Here's what I'm thinking," and get everybody's opinions on the table before you make a decision. That gets to the point of, is there a family member who's raising their hand and saying, I am interested, or are there not, right? So you just starting that earlier rather than later is really important, because what you don't want to end up with is a situation where you think a family member is interested and then they turn out not to be, and now you're stuck. Or you start the process of selling to a third party, and all of a sudden a family member chimes in and says, wait a minute, I'm interested. So having those conversations really early and having them be not set in stone is a huge way to do that. And it ties in with what I talked about earlier, which is to say, I, as the business owner, here is my plan. This is what I want to do next and on what time frame. And then that helps guide that conversation of, okay, you're going to have your chance now. Say your piece now. We're going to move down a path here. Hopefully that's helpful in terms of earlier is better.
Earlier is better, and it also sounds like keeping it into layman terms and asking those key questions. And I know, having come out, having been in finance and done valuations before, we can get into the jargon. But as you're sitting with the family, how do you explain what valuation is and how it works and the concept of risk in a way that they can go, okay, I see how my participation in this is going to either lift the valuation or potentially impair the valuation. And especially since I heard from GF data lately that 82% of exits are actually below their optimal valuation. So clearly something's wrong and this process needs to be fixed. So on that note, how do you explain it to them in a way that it becomes collaborative and team oriented and people understand their role?
I think that's a big piece of it, is having the conversation and assigning roles. One of the other early pieces is building an advisory team, which is a fancy way of saying you got to make sure that your financial planner is involved. You got to make sure that your estate planner is involved, the other professionals that can help. But really, it's around just making sure that the family, in this case, understands at a basic level how companies do get valued. That can be a rather mechanical one. The basic idea is it's earnings times a multiple. That's a pretty simple way to say it. And then you say, but there are these levers, and the levers that impact that are how risky those earnings are to continue. What I typically do is bring up examples of risk factors. One risk factor may be that there's no management level between the owner and the workers. There's a gap there. And so if something were to happen to the owner, the earnings would be at risk because there's kind of nobody to fill in the gaps. And so that's what I try and do, is just give examples of things that increase risk, and if the family or if the group is, it kind of understands the business. I'll talk about customer concentration risk. I'll say, hey, there's a risk here because 80% of the revenue is coming from 3 customers. And if one of those customers goes away, that's a really big deal. And so I talk about risks in as concrete a terms as I can, just so that they know that it's not a purely mechanical calculation as to how value is derived.
No, I think that's good to bring it back down to because I think people forget that, past performance is not projected of future performance, especially with all this topsy-turvy stuff going on with the economy. Really appreciate your time. So if you want to leave kind of the concept of Like, what's the one thing she wanted to leave someone or piece of advice for a company that's thinking about selling, particularly around the whole concept of company risk specific, company specific risk premium, and that idea that the leadership, the leadership can both boost and impair performance or valuations. What's the one thing you would leave us with?
I'm going to go back to getting owner independence is the single biggest thing to work on today. And that back to my 2 week vacation test, if you can confidently say, yeah, I could leave for 2 weeks and everything would be just as it was when I left or even better, that would be the biggest indicator to me of where you are as a company and how prepared you are to transition out of.
No, that's great advice. And I really appreciate your time. We try to keep these short and to the point, but this was a great conversation about risk, particularly around how to incorporate family into both mitigating against it and also preparing the owner and founder for the next journey beyond their company.
Awesome. I appreciate the questions. This was fun.
Thank you so much. And until next time, thanks, everybody.